Hey, it's Clay. Welcome to another video. This is going to be a little bit of a tutorial on, I'm using Reaper this time, but this really would apply to just about any recording situation. We're going to talk about the very basics of using EQ in your recordings in the mixing process to improve things. This is just a very introductory basic level. In no way is this supposed to be kind of an advanced or a high level. This is just trying to give a very basic understanding of how EQ works in your mixes, and hopefully can try to display that today. So I've got a track I've been working on. Let's just listen to it for a couple of seconds to get an idea of what's going on.
Where do we go to draw the line?
Okay, so we have kind of a lot of things going on. This is really a work in progress. In no way is this finished, but this will be a good example. Give us something to work with. We've got some acoustic guitar, we've got vocals, and we've got bass. Um, and so I'm going to go ahead and start with the acoustic guitar. So what for the first and foremost thing to understand is that I have actually grouped these tracks. So I've got my main acoustic here, and then I duplicated it, and then this is only reverb. So in this track, I have my reverb here, and you can see that it's set totally to wet. So I'm going to focus just primarily on this track right here, which is my dry acoustic, and we're going to talk about some of this EQ that I'm using. So first and foremost, Reaper has a really nice EQ, and that's what I'm going to use. There are other EQs that I have. I think pretty much all of these right here are free EQs that you can use. I'm just going to use Reaper's because it's free and it's simple to use. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics of how EQ works, and then I'm going to go into some examples. So feel free to skip forward if you understand the very basics of EQ. But this right here is your equalization spectrum. This is basically the range of human hearing and also the range that audio is processed digitally. You go from about 20K all the way up to 20 hertz up to 20K hertz. So this right to left is the spectrum. Let's go ahead and open up a new EQ, and we'll just start from scratch. So you can see this is it gives you a nice, you've got all these bands to work with all across the spectrum. And so with this EQ, you have some different controls here. And so you've got your frequency. This controls where along the frequency spectrum this particular band is going to be active. You've got gain, which either decreases or increases. And then you've got bandwidth, which typically you can see is changing how sharp or how soft the curve is. And all of these interact really nicely with the type that you pick. The type is very important. So you've got low shelf, high shelf. So what this does is a low shelf will just give you a cutoff, basically. Everything below that gets cut off. High shelf will be the opposite. Band is just going to give you a very narrow, so you can see that this is just going to be one specific little band here, just kind of in one area. A low pass is going to be, all right, we'll start with high pass. So high pass and low pass are really important filters to understand straight off. The big idea here is that the high passes. So everything that is higher than the frequency you have selected will pass through the filter, but everything below it will be filtered out. And we'll come back to these in just a second. So low pass will be on the other end. And then you have notch, which is kind of the opposite of band. Notch doesn't do any boosting or cutting. It just takes everything away, creates a notch at that frequency. And then bandpass is just allowing things to pass at that spectrum. Notch and bandpass are kind of helpful to kind of really hone in on a specific frequency while you're testing, but it's not necessarily something that you use as much unless for like a very specific purpose. And then you have your alternative bands. So let's go ahead and just talk about the band first. This is kind of your most typical and common approach. And the big thing to keep here is the bandwidth, or sometimes this is the Q. But you can see how right here at a very low bandwidth, this is a very, very narrow. So we're just looking at a very specific set of frequencies, and we are cutting or boosting in that specific area, whereas some of these other ones are going to cover more broads. Band is able to get very narrow, which is can be very handy. Um, and then the high and low pass. These are the three I'm going to focus on today. So the first place to start. So now that we kind of understand what the controls are, that this is our frequency spectrum, let's start talking about how we use them. So the first one that I want to start with is the high pass. This is probably the most fundamental place and the most universally useful of all the EQ filters. So what you're doing with this high pass, like I said earlier, is that everything that is above this frequency is passing. So that's all of this stuff is going through and everything below is being cut out. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to disable every other effects, and let's just listen to this for 1 second, and hopefully you can maybe hear it. I'm going to solo. Okay, so that probably, unless you have very good hearing, you probably didn't necessarily hear exactly what was happening. However, there is a very easy way to test this. And so what this is doing is this is removing the very low end of the frequency spectrum, so everything below 124 hertz. And so a really, really nice way to learn what this does is to actually do the exact opposite. So to teach you what a high pass filter does, we're going to use the low pass filter. So now instead of passing everything above, we're passing everything below, the low pass. Everything below passes. So now let's listen. Okay, so that hopefully is a very clear way of seeing that all that is going on here at this frequencies, below 124 hertz, is just this really woofy kind of noisy low end of this acoustic guitar. Now, in order to kind of understand so now that we know what's going on here, now we kind of get into the next step, which is kind of your arrangement. And so if you think about a typical mix, you have, so in this track I have a bass guitar. So my bass guitar is going to occupy much of the low end, and so we don't want the acoustic to fit into that spectrum. In order to play well with other instruments, it often is smart to kind of carve out a frequency space where that instrument does really well. And so on acoustic, it's really nice to cut away this very, very low end in order to keep things nice and clear for our bass guitar. So we're going to start with a high pass. We're just going to do it right at 100 about. And you can mess around with this a little bit if you want. I kind of like to have it fairly even, so I'll put it right there just so that it stays nice and curved and then drops off nicely. The gain doesn't do anything. So our high pass there is really nice. We want to get rid of that yucky low end that doesn't do anything for us. High pass filters are really, really useful. On almost every track, it is useful to have a high pass filter of some sort to get rid of that ultra low end. Even on things like a bass guitar or a bass kick, you want to have a high pass filter maybe at like 40 or 50 instead of 100, just to get rid of some super duper low end. Now let's go to the opposite and let's talk about our low passes. So now this filter will go all the way, our recording, I guess, our audio will go all the way up to 20K. That doesn't necessarily mean that we want to do that. So let's do the same process. Let's do let's do the opposite. So in order to teach you what a low pass means, we're going to set up a high pass, and we're just going to listen. Okay, so hopefully that's very enlightening. That I started at about 5,000, and I went up to about 12 or 13, and it's just this really kind of scratchy, really piercing high end of these acoustic guitar transients, and I don't find that very pleasing. So again, for we talked about our friend the high pass filter. On the high end, it's nice to have a low pass filter to tame some of that ultra uber duper high end, those kind of transients, those harsh, brittle sounds, just to kind of tame it and bring it under control. And so, just kind of as a general rule of thumb, everything past about this 1300 range gets really, really high and piercing. So this filter right here, let's bring this guy to about 50. So this exact setup with a high pass on 50 and a low pass on about 13. This is really, really safe on almost every single recording track that you could use. Everything below 50 and above 1300 is not necessarily going to be real pleasing stuff that is necessary, and you're mostly just going to be cutting away stuff that you don't need. And by doing so, you make your other parts a lot more clear, and they cut through a lot nicely because they're not battling with these harsh or yucky frequencies that we don't like so much. So just as a basic note, also on acoustic, we're going to bump this up a little bit because we don't want to fight with the bass guitar. And maybe just bring this down just a little bit because we do like some high end on our acoustic. So we'll start with that. So this right here with the high and low passes is like fundamentals #1. So let's just leave that and we'll start a new one. So now I want to talk about our bands. And this is kind of where we get into some more fine tuning. So once you kind of have your basic high and low pass figured out, now we want to kind of more surgically go into the track's frequency spectrum and look more specifically at, I guess, target areas. And so the best way to do that is, again, like we use the opposites. In order to teach you what the high pass does, we use the low pass. So the opposite of the band would be the band pass. So what we're doing here, especially if we narrow down this cue, is we are only allowing just this very little narrow piece of the frequency spectrum to come through. So let's hear what that sounds like. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what's going on with this bandpass. So what I like to do here is sometimes there are certain frequencies that are, I think the word would be offensive, or maybe they're harsh in some way. Not all instruments, maybe just like the way it got played or the way that it got picked up by the microphone, maybe there's something that just doesn't sound very good. And this is a good way to go hunting for those things and take it out, so that the more pleasing parts of your instrument or voice or whatever can really shine through, and they're not going to be competing with that more yucky stuff. So here we're, with this EQ, we said, well, it's pretty much a blanket statement. Everything below or above this frequency really isn't needed. Well, with this one, we don't want to cut out, like maybe we have a harsh thing at about, or maybe we've got a harsh frequency right at about, I don't know, 260. Well, we don't want to just cut out all of this stuff. There might be some really good things going on in the 500 or at the 200 range. Maybe we just want 260. So we're going to use a more surgical, a more specific, kind of a more finely tuned approach to really get after what we want. And so again, just like with our high and low passes, the best way to learn what to do with the band is to really exaggerate it. So if you turn, what I did is I cranked the gain up, but then I really narrow the bandwidth. And so I'm not going to go into it too much here, but the basic idea is that when you do this, when you go through, you can hear, oh, that when I got to a certain frequency, something really harsh jumped out at me or was accentuated. Maybe there's a certain frequency, like with that the fingers are sliding across the strings, or the way the pick is hitting the strings, that's causing something very harsh. Then once you find it with this, then you can pull the gain down to maybe do a 3 dB cut keep the bandwidth fairly narrow, so you're only really drawing away just a narrow portion um, of your mix. So those are kind of the three basic filters right there. Um, we talked about the high and low pass and also the specific bands. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is understanding how these frequencies fit throughout all of the instruments. Um, because that can really help you identify to make smart choices. So with this information, how do you actually use it? So let's talk about bass first and foremost. So one of I guess, introductory ways that I have found success in um, using EQ in a way that's effective in creating, space in your mix for all of your instruments is to try and find a specific, if you even just look at this visually, you want to find a specific section of the EQ curve where that instrument really shines and really kind of owns that, and it has it all to itself. So with the bass guitar, I have a high pass at 45, but then a low pass at 1800. So with the bass guitar, I have really shifted and focused on the low end. So the bass guitar is really providing the low end of the mix. Then moving up to the acoustic, I am cutting more, quite a bit actually. So this was at 90, at about 100. If I was playing with even other instruments, I might bump this up to 150, just because the low end on the acoustic, it's meant to tandem with the bass, but not provide it itself. So this is providing, when I do this, it provides a lot of clarity with the bass. So actually, I want to try and display that really quickly. So I'm going to solo the acoustic and the bass, and we're going to try and listen to this. And hopefully my point will come across, is whenever I disable the effects, I'm going to disable with this button right here. Whenever I disable it, then the EQ will be off, and then the acoustic will be fighting. But when I turn it back on, then the acoustic should make more space for the bass. So feel free to go back and listen to that again. If you're wearing headphones or if you have studio monitors, you'll probably hear it a lot better. Whenever this was red, whenever it's turned off, to my ear, the bass and the acoustic seem to fight with one another, and it's a lot more muddy and messy, and you don't hear either of them as clearly as when the effect is green and the EQ curve is enabled and this low end is being taken away from the acoustic, creating space for the bass. And in the end, you hear both instruments more clearly in the range that they're meant to be. And then for vocals, we can just look quick. Again, got a high pass here at 120, so that's taking away quite a bit of low end, and then bumping just slightly at certain frequencies. Kind of where I felt like it was nice, and I wanted to accentuate that to help distinguish it from the acoustic guitar. And as a final note, just in general, you'll see I'm doing a lot of cutting away, but only a little bit of boosting. And I find that is a really nice approach to use, especially if you're a beginner, is to really only focus on taking away harsh or difficult things. And by doing so, you create a lot more clarity in all of the things that you like, just because it's fighting much less with the difficult things. So I hope that this is helpful. Please let me know in the comment section down below if you have any questions or comments or other areas that you'd like me to cover. But this is just a beginner's primer on EQ in Reaper. Thanks. I'll see you again soon. Bye.